Thank you to everyone who's joined us this morning. Thank you also to David Rogovic. David is Assistant Vice President in Moody's Sovereign Ratings Group. Thank you so much, David, for joining us. And it's a pleasure to have everyone here this morning. First of all, I just wanted to say thank you again to David and to Moody's for doing this huge body of research that contained a lot of information that I myself was not aware of. And it's quite alarming to see that some of these statistics that point to kind of long-term challenges that we will have in this region. And I don't think the policymakers are yet grappling with this information and shaping policy in a way that can address it. So it's my pleasure to have you here, David, to share the research that you all did. Again, thank you for doing this research and for coming on the webinar to discuss it with us and everyone on the call.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Marla.
So, David, the first thing I want to ask is what motivated you and your team at Moody's to do this research and publish it?
Sure. So we published a report where we examined the evolving demographic profiles and the changes more generally in the quantity and quality of human capital in the Caribbean and in Central America. And when we look at these two regions, there's actually a wide range in terms of sovereigns, in terms of credit quality, in terms of economic structure. So we've got countries at the higher end of the rating scale, like the Cayman Islands. We have tourism-based economies like the Bahamas and commodity producers like Trinidad and Tobago. And what we wanted to do was to explore how social factors were affecting credit quality in the region. And demographics, for instance, is one of the secular trends that's really shaping credit markets and credit conditions globally. And in the Caribbean, which already has an average age above the global average, the population will continue to age, and we'll see important changes in the demographic profile, which will have an impact on the credit quality of some of these countries over time. We also looked at how immigration and how high rates of migration in the region are compounding some of these demographic changes. And we see challenges there as well, what that means for the human capital that's remaining in the countries. And while we do see some challenges, there are also certain opportunities, and the negative impact on growth from the challenges related to demographics, related to net migration, could be offset by advances in human capital, which increase productivity growth and competitiveness. And human capital, as you're well aware, depends on things like educational achievement, educational attainment, access to education, access to good quality public health care, income inequality, poverty rates, crime, etc. So we thought it was important research to look at these factors and to see how they would affect the credit quality in the Caribbean and Central America.
Right. And the thing is, what affects credit quality, I guess, because credit quality and sovereign credit ratings specifically, basically, the product of so many things, a whole host of other factors, in addition to the standard growth and fiscal numbers and debt numbers and so on. It's indirectly affected by so many of the social indicators, as we know, and political indicators as well, institutional indicators as well. Yeah, it makes sense that these demographic and social trends will, of course, have direct and indirect impacts on credit ratings. So again, I mean, it's amazing that you all did this huge body of work, and I congratulate you and thank you for that. I really hope that people take the time to look at it. But I just wanted to talk a little bit in a little more detail now about some of the underlying findings in the report. So, for example, the report found that the Caribbean has the highest net outward migration rate in the world. And that was quite alarming to me. I know that there are some countries that have a high net outward migration rate, but I wasn't aware that as a region that was also true. You want to just share with us what your findings were in the report around migration specifically?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so as you said, the Caribbean has the highest rate of net migration, although it has been declining over the past decade or so, since the early part of the 2000s, but still the highest in the world. And although it's high, there is like you said, some variation across the region. So you have countries like a Jamaica or a St. Vincent with relatively high net migration rates, but
Yes.
then you also have countries like the Bahamas, which see a net inflow into the population each year. So it's a pretty broad spectrum, and you said we have countries like a Jamaica at the higher end of the scale,
The highest, yes.
Bahamas seeing
Hmm.
inflows, and for countries that are seeing the net emigration, so people leaving their country, this is compounding some of the problems related to demographics. In addition, if you look at the types of people that are leaving, they're generally younger, around the ages of 20 to 25, and more highly educated. So you have the effect of what we talk about as brain drain, where a country's
Hmm.
losing its youngest, most productive members of the country, and they're leaving the country, and that leaves has negative externalities for
Hmm.
the remaining population via capacity for innovation, for instance. So just if you look at it, we looked at some numbers, and in the U.S., about half of Caribbean immigrants have a college education. These are people born in the Caribbean now residing in the US. And that's comparable to what we see for the US native born population. Um,
Right.
Take another example, look at Jamaica. If you look at female immigrants from Jamaica in the US, around half have a college education. That's twice the rate of the educational attainment of the remaining population in the home country. So about a
Wow.
quarter of Jamaican women have a college degree or higher in Jamaica, and about half of
Half.
Jamaican immigrants in the US have a college education. So that really has significant
Wow.
implications when you think about the quality of the labor force that's remaining, and the loss really of that to the labor force from immigration. Um, just briefly, if there are these negative trends via brain drain, via demographics, there is one positive aspect to a large stock of immigrants living abroad, and that's remittances.
Remittances,
And
yes.
and
Mhm.
this is really important when you think about consumption smoothing, money coming back into the country. This is particularly important in the Caribbean. If you look at we've looked at some numbers, and if you look at just the average rate of remittances to GDP in a country in the region the year prior to
Mhm.
a storm hitting or natural disaster and the year after, what you see is a significant increase in remittances in the year after. So this has important implications for economic growth, and think about consumption smoothing. This is an important source of income that would not be there otherwise. So there are some offsetting factors that offset some of the negative implications from high rates of net migration from demographics. The other positive is that remittances is generally considered to be a more stable
Mhm.
source of foreign currency. So as opposed to more volatile sources of capital inflows, remittances tend to be pretty sticky. So it provides some stability there as well.
Yes, I saw that, and you're right about the remittance flows. The thing is, it's a trade-off, right? Having a remittance flow from labor that exists outside or resides outside of your
Mm,
island jurisdiction is positive. But if that labor was here, resident on island, and can actually find productive work that best uses its skill, that to me is even better. Now, I
yeah.
just want to cite here what I'm looking at in your report, where Jamaica has the highest in the region in terms of net outward migration,
Hmm.
followed by Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, Haiti, Cuba, and Trinidad and Tobago. Then you
Hmm.
have positive net inward migration in Barbados and Bahamas. Um, and this is 2010 to 2015 data I'm looking
Hmm.
at here. Now, just wanted to highlight that in recent years, we've had in Trinidad and Tobago, we've seen probably what is net inward migration as a result of what's happening in Venezuela. And also in Guyana. In Guyana, I know that this is a country you don't cover at Moody's, but just wanted to, for the benefit of those on the call, from what I understand, Guyana is having a net inward migration
Hmm.
rate, so this is positive, I guess, for these countries, but many other countries I'm seeing here in the data that show net outward migration. And um, I can't help but wonder, and I know you didn't focus a lot on the issue of crime in your report, but I can't help but wonder to what extent some of this has to do with crime in Jamaica in particular, and perhaps in Trinidad. but in Puerto Rico, there seems to me to be a much broader underlying problem in Puerto Rico, which of course was exacerbated by the storms last year. Any comment you want to make on those things?
Yeah, I mean, so you think about migration and what drives it, and if you look at the Caribbean and you compare it to Central America, in Central America, it tends to be driven more by income differentials. So
Mhm.
countries with lower income migrate to countries with higher income levels, sort of looking for more economic opportunity. In the Caribbean, I agree that there may be some impact on crime and because of what's happening in Venezuela, but a lot of the migration you do see is as a result of natural disasters and being displaced. So um, those are two broad factors that tend to drive migration to
Yes.
varying degrees. Income differentials in Central America, natural disasters more in the Caribbean.
Mhm. Indeed, that's so true. And we do see that right after disaster, you can tell. But so let me just switch now to the whole issue of aging.
Mm,
So, um, w- so when you have your working age population largely leaving, that leaves
mm,
you with an older population and a younger population that are dependent.
yep,
So I saw in your report that we have the highest in the world in terms of a level of
that's
dependency
right.
ratio. Um, and I know that in some countries, the birth rate in this region is low. So that, of
Yep,
course, will exacerbate the net outward migration effect. So we do have an organically that aging effect. In Barbados, where I am right now, actually, is one of the few countries where the over 60 population is already higher than the under 15 population. So could you share with me what your findings were around the whole idea and issue of aging in this
yeah.
region?
So Barbados is one example where I think the replacement rate is already, or fertility rates are already below replacement rates. So you are
Correct.
seeing that compounding effect on the demographic profile. But what we found in terms of demographics was the Caribbean has an average age of the population already above 30. A country like Barbados, the average age is something like 38, 39 years old.
Mm-hmm.
In Jamaica, it's 34 years old. This compares to a relatively younger age in Central America, around 26, 27 years old. So there's issue there related to an older population. And then, as you alluded to, the dependency ratio, so the share of the population over the age of 60, that has to be supported by, as you mentioned, a smaller labor force because of migration effects. And over time, this will be compounded. I think based on the latest projections from the UN, by 2050, around a quarter of the total population could be over the age of 60 in the Caribbean. And then if you look at that in more granular detail, what you could see is start to see a skew towards people not just over 60, but closer to 80 years old. And so that's going to have important implications in terms of spending on healthcare, on pensions. But when we talk about the dependency rate, there's really two channels that we see having an effect on the credit profile of a sovereign. The first is via per capita income. So if you have a smaller labor force, in order to maintain the same level of per capita income, you have to become increasingly productive. If not,
Mm-hmm.
there will be a negative effect via on your economic strength and economic growth. And the second is the spending related challenges that may fall on the on the burden of the government in these countries
Mm-hmm.
via increased spending on healthcare, increased spending on pensions. The one offset to that would be likely lower spending on education as your population ages and you have fewer younger people, then the government spending on primary, secondary, tertiary education could decline. But based on projections from the UN and others, the increase in spending on healthcare and pensions would outweigh the reduction in spending on education. And so that would have implications for a country's fiscal strength and fiscal profile if
Mm-hmm.
that increase in spending isn't offset by higher revenue or lower spending in other areas of government expenditures.
Right, so there will be fiscal pressures from this. But before we even get to the fiscal pressures, there will be pressures and I guess an increase in poverty,
Yeah.
and which we are seeing in. I mean, with respect to human development indicators, we're seeing many countries in the region in the last 10 years have declined in their human development ranking. Um, and if with respect to poverty, there are countries in the region that are seeing an increase in poverty. Now, as you're saying, to sort of counteract the effect of all of these, we have to have higher levels of productivity,
Mm-hmm.
higher levels of competitiveness. Um, to achieve that, it's difficult to achieve that when you have poverty increasing. And
Mm-hmm.
so much of poverty alleviation rests on as a burden rests on the shoulders of the government. And to a certain extent, the development banks and so on, but still that's borrowing that the government
Yep.
has to engage in. Um, Discuss with me, tell me what I mean, in your report, you spoke about innovation, the role of innovation, the role of education in helping as a region to buck this trend. I personally see as a potential avenue for, I guess, if not circumventing, but directly mitigating this problem is the advent of the online or gig economy.
Mm.
And so if we have people residing within the region or even without and outside of the region who can work online and, as you say, tap into the fact that we have an educated workforce. As a
Mm-hmm.
matter of fact, in the Caribbean, we have closed the gender gap with respect to education in most countries, but
Mm-hmm.
we haven't closed the gender gap with respect to wages, right? And I see this as an opportunity for people in the Caribbean to access the gig economy, access online work, to earn revenue and earn foreign currency, more importantly,
Mm-hmm.
as they reside here. But also, I see the Caribbean as potentially being the kind of place where we can attract people who are educated and already tapped in and working in the online gig economy globally, and have an immigration policy, sorry, that attracts people to our shores to come and live and work in a comfortable, safe, and attractive environment. I mean, Manhattan skyline is lovely,
Mm.
but I'm sure you would love to be on the beach if given an opportunity on a sunny day, right?
Yeah, ask me
um,
that question in December, and I will be. Yeah.
I will.
Yeah.
So my point is, I feel as though we are blessed with all of this natural beauty in the Caribbean, and tourists come here. But what about the people who we can attract to come here and work and continue to access the online and gig economy and earn revenue that way? What we really have to ensure to attract people is we have to have a proper migration policy.
Mhm.
We have to have good connectivity. Internet cannot be a challenge, right?
Mhm.
Internet connectivity. And we also have to solve the issue of crime. So that's my thought around. So I feel like we can tap into this gig economy for domestic users, as well as attract foreigners who want to come in and work in that space and live and work in the Caribbean. But share with me your findings in terms of
Yeah.
how innovation and education and so on play a role in
Yeah. You
changing this trend. Mhm.
you brought up a lot of good points about education and creating this environment that would support innovation. And you mentioned crime as being a factor that would reducing crime would be a factor in attracting more people, either immigrants back into the country or foreigners to come into the country to help and work in this gig economy, as you mentioned. Um,
Mhm.
and they go hand, these are all sort of interrelated, right? If you think about education in the Caribbean, one of the factors that prevents certain kids from going to school is just the high cost of education. Transportation costs or something can take up about 10% of a household's income just to get their kids to school.
Mhm.
Then you add in the cost of textbooks, of other school supplies, and this
Mhm.
ties into inequality and making sure that education opportunities are available to the entire scope of or entire range of a population. So these are interrelated, and then what you see is family or children and families that come from more from a lower income status or lower income level that grew up in a violent household tend to be more likely to commit violent crimes in the future. So it's these, again, all sort of are related to
Secular.
each other and
Mm.
it's circular. Exactly. So I think you're exactly right. I mean, there are these in certain countries, crime is high, and that's a constraint to businesses setting up shop in the country. They require to spend a certain amount of their income or their revenue on security. So these are factors that are affecting not only business development, but are related to developments or things that happen early on in a child's development. So related to educational attainment, access to good quality education. So uh, certainly, I mean, what we saw, we looked at some different ways that we looking at education or quality of education and capacity for innovation. There are some international surveys that look at this, and then we see a positive relationship in general when we looked at the region and even countries outside the region. And then we looked at capacity for innovation and against foreign direct investment, and we saw the same positive relationship. So there's certainly something
Mm.
there that high quality education, a country that has a scope and capacity for innovation are going to be the countries that attract FDI, which is going to be one of the foundations for spurring investment and further growth in an economy.
Yeah, and you're right. I mean, the thing is, one of the things I keep harping on in this region is that I guess I don't know if it has to do with the way we were educated, but politicians repeatedly say things like, the government needs to spend in order for there to be growth. But you and I know that government spending does not generate growth in this region because of the high fiscal leakage and therefore low fiscal multipliers. And so what we really need is a private sector-led growth strategy. And to your point, private sector-led growth relies on investment, and a lot of it would be foreign investment. And that relies on an educated labor force and a safe environment to live in and work
Mhm.
in, but it also requires that the government has an agenda to facilitate business. So, ease of doing business reforms, public sector reforms that make the public sector much more facilitative and conducive to private business flourishing. All of those things we need to have, and I think we need to have an overarching strategy and policy of the government to achieve these things, to achieve a private sector led growth strategy, to attract foreign investment by making sure you have a safe environment that is conducive to business and living and working. And it sounds like, in a nutshell, it sounds easy, but it's simple, but it's not easy. And I just have a feeling that from what I observe, I don't know, except maybe here in Barbados, where I'm right now, and perhaps Jamaica as well, Grenada to a certain extent, which of course have come out of an recent IMF program. I don't know that the other countries in this region have that kind of an overarching strategy around and policy around facilitating private sector led growth and investment. Because investment and exports, you think about a GDP equation, C plus G plus I plus X minus N, consumption
Mhm.
plus investment plus government spending plus exports minus imports. Those things that drive growth in this region are really investments and exports. And I don't know that the governments and the policymakers in this region get that. But I think, and I would want to encourage you and your colleagues at Moody's, now that you have this data, it is very powerful, I think, when you put out a ratings report that the government understands clearly what are the factors that are driving the outcomes that they're seeing in the ratings. So, whereas we typically see in a ratings report debt is moving in this direction, fiscal deficit is moving in this direction, reserves are moving in this direction, and therefore we have this result here in the credit rating. Perhaps we need to weave into the analysis more of this type of data that is not, I suppose, generally the focus, simply because you can have a policy now that fixes your deficit for the next year or two. These kinds of demographic problems require much longer term thinking and much longer term planning and policy making and strategy, which generally in this region we don't engage in. There is this 5 year obsession. The electoral cycle dictates in many ways the policy agenda, the spending, and so on. But anyway, I've said a whole lot there in one statement. But yes, I think a private sector-led growth strategy is so important. And the way that we need to achieve that is, as I said, we have to look at net having a migration policy and a business ease of doing business facilitation policy and agenda. What are your thoughts around public sector reforms and so on to facilitate that?
Yeah, I mean, certainly one area, one factor that would reduce the level of net migration, would reduce brain drain, would facilitate private investment is certainly creating a more conducive business environment that
Mhm.
attracts this sort of investment. We mentioned reducing crime, using government resources more efficiently. I mean, if you think about spending on education, and we talk about brain drain and most highly educated people leaving a country, well, if you look at it from the government perspective, the return on investment on that educational spending is quite low because you're losing all of
Exactly.
the most productive, qualified people to migration. So I think you touched on a lot of really important points. We do look at all these factors in our ratings, in our methodology, but as you mentioned, a lot of them are very long term, and
Hmm.
therefore it's hard to pinpoint precisely how each factor or each risk affects a particular rating because the risks materialize over a very long period of time
Yeah.
and in part depend on how the governments respond and react to these challenges. And so you're talking about a 10, 15, 20-year time period that we're talking about for demographics. It's you won't see the impact in 1 year. Whereas you mentioned you look at the focus on deficit reduction, you can clearly see
Hmm.
deficit from year to year or debt levels from year to year, while the demographics are going to have a longer term implication
Exactly.
and therefore take a bit longer to play out.
Yeah, and it's harder to get the policymakers to focus on those things because to them it's all the way out there. Like they're probably thinking, oh, I might be dead by 2050, when the demographic is going to
Yeah.
shift to my disadvantage. So it's very difficult to get the policymakers to focus on that. But I encourage you to put whatever pressures you can to get that focus to be not only on the immediate of the fiscal and the external balances, but the longer term demographic and social shifts as well. Um, Before we go to questions, there was one more thing that I want to touch on. Um, and you talk about in your report about how inequality and poverty is constraining growth. And I think that it's fairly clear how poverty and rising inequality can constrain growth. But one way that I am seeing poverty and inequality affecting overall macroeconomic performance in a way that's probably not so obvious or maybe not addressed from a policy perspective. I don't know how you can, but I feel that a lot of the political outcomes we're seeing, not just in this region, but globally, has to do with the fact that inequality is I mean, if not at a historical high, but certainly in the last century or so, it's the highest we've seen on a global scale. And so you have a lot of populist governments, for example, um, being elected, and then, of course, um, spending money in a way that you, for example, you will see that impact on a credit rating. Apart from that, what are your findings and your research about the implications for poverty and inequality in the short term and then in the longer term on credit ratings?
Yeah, well, you tend to see a relationship where countries with higher inequality, with greater levels of poverty, tend to have perform worse when you look at other social indicators.
Hmm.
And one thing that's worth pointing out actually is in the Caribbean, we actually have seen an improvement in the Gini coefficients. We want to measure inequality using that measure, there has been an improvement since the 1980s. So it's it's improving. It may still be an unequal society, but there's a slight improvement. And And there's an important relationship between inequality and productivity growth. So there have been studies done by the IMF, for instance, have looked at it, and you see that countries with lower Gini coefficients tend to have higher productivity growth and vice versa. So there's a really important implication there about inequality, poverty, and what that means for growth rates. And that in turn, growth rates to the extent that they lead to higher fiscal revenue, gave the governments more scope and capacity to spend to address these issues. I think crime, for instance, is a big issue that you've seen increasing in importance in some countries over the past few years. And there have been some measures taken. In Jamaica, for instance, they've tended to use these zones of special operations. In Trinidad and the latest budget, they talked a lot about crime and using more advanced forms of technology to identify high crime areas. And these have generally been viewed more globally as some of the most effective ways of addressing crime. So
Yes.
you may not see an impact immediately, but I think those two are good examples of where the governments are taking steps and have looked at crime and trying to address it. It's just a matter of how long it takes to play out and to have a positive effect.
Yeah, no, you're right. And I think it's so different between countries in the Caribbean. I mean, if you look at Grenada, for example, Grenada, which I don't think you cover, but
Mm-hmm.
it's, very small island, of course, very high level of unemployment. I think it's somewhere around 20%, certainly in the double digits, and youth unemployment is somewhere around 40%, but they have a very low level of crime, and remarkably so. And I think it has a lot to do with their very close-knit communities. And so, yeah, there's not always that automatic relationship between unemployment and poverty, inequality, and crime, but certainly in other countries there is. In Trinidad, we had our highest kidnapping rate when the economy was growing at like double digits almost, and or very close to very high levels of growth in 2007, 6, 7. Um, anyway, but yes, we do have to address these. I'm happy to hear that inequality, I know some countries we saw inequality increase and some decline, but there are some countries where inequality in this region is really, really amazing. And I wonder how a society can hold it together with those levels of inequality. But we have to deal with it from a policy perspective, right? Um, so perhaps now it's 10:34. Perhaps we can go to questions now. I can sit and talk to you till tomorrow about this, David. But maybe we should let other people get a chance to ask questions and to engage.
Thank you, Marla. I've gotten several questions in regarding pension plans, and that's kind of where I'd like to start out. And they're mostly directed towards, first, do you have any idea how much of pension plans are actually publicly funded and how much are privately funded? And then what do you consider that the impact on pension plans for the populations will be in these countries where they are publicly funded or privately funded? What could the difference look like?
David, you want to take a shot at that?
Yeah, I think a lot of the impact from on pension spending related to demographics and aging depends on if generosity ratios are maintained, if benefit ratios are maintained. So it's hard to pinpoint, but for instance, the United Nations did a study. They looked at 10 Caribbean countries and the impact on fiscal spending related to healthcare and pensions related to aging. And I think for the 10 countries that they looked at, they expected pension and healthcare spending to double by 2050. So quite significant impact over a long period of time. And this was based on certain assumptions, but again, I think it highlights some of the challenges related to aging and how much of that burden will fall on the government
Mm-hmm.
versus the private sector.
I think it's obvious that the pension schemes, the national insurance, for example, in many countries in the region are coming under a lot of pressure, and some of them are underfunded already from an actuarial standpoint, actuarial evaluation standpoint, from what I've seen. And what happens is, as to your point, if fiscal spending on pension and healthcare is going to double by 2050. I can see why, because what happens is that if the National Insurance Fund cannot continue to honor the obligations under the benefits, it becomes a central government obligation. I think there has been an effort, for example, to raise the retirement rate in some countries in the region to try to alleviate some of this pressure on the public pension schemes. And with an aging population, I think that would be a growing trend, having that pressure to raise the retirement rate. But I think there will also be pressure to cut back on benefits or to put a fixed benefit schemes as opposed to fixed contribution schemes. So I think, and I think I've seen some of that already happening. So already we're seeing the signs of the pressure that's being felt by the pension plans and having to adjust in a low interest rate environment as well. The portfolios are under pressure. I mean, now we have, for the past year or so, we've had interest rates edging up in the US, but still quite low. And that is putting a lot of pressure on pension plans, pension schemes, portfolios. I think that what has to happen as well is that the pension schemes, a lot of them are subject to legislation that limits or that sets thresholds for the types of investments they can hold in their portfolio. So, for example, they have limits set on how much equity can be held in a pension portfolio. That's, I think in Trinidad, for example, it might be 25% if memory serves me correct. And in a low interest rate environment, given that we have all of this pressure now for building for benefits and less contributions as the population ages, I think we need to look at these pieces of legislation that limits the kinds of instruments and how much of the different types of instruments that you can put in. Because if you are 75% in fixed income in a persistent low interest rate environment, you can imagine what's going to happen to that portfolio. Whereas in the past 5 years, if you were allowed to hold more of your portfolio in equity, you might have been able to mitigate some of that fall off or stagnant plateauing, basically, of your fixed income revenue. I think those are things that we need. So, raising the retirement age and relooking at the legislation around the portfolios, the limits on portfolio holdings of different types of instruments in these pension funds. I think those are things that we need to look at in this region to alleviate this challenge.
Yeah, I would just add, yeah, I agree. Raising pension ages has been something that's been tried and been done in several countries already. Also, the contribution made by the worker versus the government, something else that will affect how pension spending in the future. So I think, yeah, you've raised some key points there, and those are sort of the well-known sort of best practices in terms of how to address pensions and demographic changes.
Yes, thank you. Melissa, can we take another question, please?
Yes, I want to continue down this path just for a second, because I've gotten a few questions around what would actually be considered a credit positive type of policy that could be put in place, and along the lines of changing the retirement age or some of the policies that Marla just discussed. I got a lot of questions in when she was speaking about that too. And so, how would increasing retirement age affect the credit rating, for example, in an aging population, or what specific policy decisions would be considered to be credit positive concerning the trends that you've been discussing?
Yeah, so at Moody's, we don't give policy advice per se. We look at a policy decision and look at the impact that has on fiscal balances. So if a change in the pension age is undertaken, we look at how that would affect the sustainability of the pension system in a country. So that's how we would look at if something's credit positive or credit negative. We'd look at the current conditions in the country, look at the impact longer term, what that means for things like growth, for fiscal balances, for the debt trajectory, but we don't provide policy advice. We analyze policy choices that are made.
So if, for example, David, a country like, let's just say like Barbados, were to increase its retirement age, and that means that to me, you have two kind of offsetting effects there from a fiscal standpoint. You have public sector workers who will then be working for longer as opposed to retiring. But on the flip side, you have a positive pressure being brought to bear on the public pension system, because it means that they will not be entitled to a pension for a longer period. So you would have to then balance those two effects and see from I guess from a numeric standpoint what the net effect would be.
Right. You look at that, you would look at, well, the retirement age, and, if life expectancy is increasing, well, increasing the retirement age doesn't really change the amount that's being paid out if life expectancy rises.
Right.
It's also about creating opportunities. So if you have a worker closing in on the retirement age, there have to be job opportunities for that person to continue working. So there are multiple factors that come into play when analyzing this.
Understood. Right. I think we could probably take another question, Melissa.
David, could you comment at all about some of the countries that you've seen in the wider region? Because, we've talked about this study. It also included Central America, you mentioned at the beginning as well. If you could just talk about some of the countries in the wider region that you've seen that are doing the best job at addressing these issues and what you've seen them doing.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think in the Caribbean, when you look at a country like Jamaica, is a good example that under an IMF program for the past several years has been taking the steps that will over time hopefully produce higher growth rates. So they've trying to reduce the deficits in the country. They have a basically balanced budget, primary surpluses, and this is reducing. If you had crowding out before because of large fiscal deficits, now you have the opposite effect where there's a lot of excess liquidity now in the system, which is encouraging credit growth. I mean, we haven't seen it yet in terms of headline real GDP growth rates, but they're taking a number of positive steps in terms of reforms, fiscal side, institutional reforms, with reforms of the Bank of Jamaica, the central bank, creating more operational independence, moving toward inflation targeting over time. And these are all examples of a country that are taking a number of structural reforms that the positive benefits take time to materialize, but we've seen this over now a 4, 5, 6-year period. That's the country that first comes to mind in terms of doing a lot to address some of the issues we talked about. We talked about crime, and crime is still an issue in Jamaica, a very high homicide rate, but these zones of special operations have been somewhat effective. They've identified in cities which down to streets and which parts of the cities have the highest crime rates, and so they're able to deploy resources that way more effectively to address this. Again, the impact will be felt over a longer period of time, but these are the sort of things that I'd point to.
And David, it's interesting that you highlight Jamaica. I mean, this is just me sticking a pin here for Jamaica, but I think they're overdue for an upgrade. So I look forward to seeing that happen soon. We don't get many upgrades in this region, and I think if anybody deserves one, it's Jamaica.
Well, I mean, we have certainly noticed a number of positive steps being taken, and we did change the outlook to positive in July this year. So I think we recognize some of the improvements, and you also still know the challenges they have in terms of a still very high debt ratio, even if it is coming down. The interest to revenue ratio is still very high, one of the highest in the world, in fact. So I think the rating balances out the positives in terms of reforms and some of these credit challenges as well.
Good. No, you're right. You're right. There are still challenges, but we're chipping away at them. Right. So maybe we can have another question, Melissa.
I only have one last question in line right now, and if you could just both share some thoughts related to income inequality and what you think can be done, what types of measures can be taken to reduce income inequality.
David, you want to go first?
I mean, I think I addressed a lot of this stuff on income inequality. It's really um, creating job opportunities. It's addressing crime, which has an impact, like I said, on education and the ability for children to get to school. It's about the quality of education as well that reduces the incentives for crime. So these are all the factors that we look at and we think about when we think about inequality and the what countries can do to address that. Um, Essentially creating more opportunities that would that would increase the opportunity cost of crime and that would result in more opportunities and reduced income inequality.
Yeah, from my perspective, no, you're right. I mean, education and having opportunities is very important. In my view, in this region and in other regions as well, I feel and I see in the data as well that a lot of the inequality that exists in terms of income inequality and therefore wealth inequality has a lot to do with gender inequality.
Mm.
And I think that there is very little being done to address gender inequality because a growing number of households are being headed by single females. And insofar as we've closed the gender gap with respect to education in this region, right? Women are now largely more educated than men, but are still being paid less than men. Therein lies a huge problem because these women have achieved the education. They've achieved, in many cases, the jobs, gotten the jobs, but they're two things. For the same job, they're being paid less. And then also there's the glass ceiling. So they can't, even though they might have the same or even more education than the men, they're not being progressed to higher levels in the organization, whether it's public sector or private sector. So, and when you have that imbalance, first of all, it's a lower return on the investment for the government that is invested in this woman's education, but also her own return on investment is lower. But also the implications for her family, because whether or not you're in a single parent home, if the female the mother is not able to achieve the kind of career and the kind of income that she would have if she was a man, you can see that immediately puts her and her family at a disadvantage. Because women's income are more closely tied to the educational and health outcomes of the children in the family, whether or not it's a female headed single household. So I think a large part of fixing the overall inequality problem has to do with fixing the gender inequality problem in this region as well as other regions. And I think that we really have to look at making sure our taxation regimes are more progressive than they are now. In some countries in the Caribbean, the taxation rate is very regressive. And that's just doesn't make sense. If you want to be fair and if you want to reduce inequality, I think you need to have a more progressive taxation regime. And I don't know that I've seen enough from a policy perspective being done to deliberately try to address the regressiveness of the existing taxation regimes. So I think those two things, addressing the gender inequality and addressing how regressive the taxation regimes are, I think those two will go a long way in helping to address inequality in this region and elsewhere as well. That's how I see it. If we don't, do we have any more questions, Melissa? And if we don't, we can both wrap up.
No, we can wrap up. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Well, David, I mean, I just want to say thank you again to you, your colleagues at Moody's, for taking the time, and clearly a lot of time and effort went into this report, which I will do my best to help share as widely as possible across the region. I thank you for doing the report and doing the analysis and for your time to share these insights with us today. These are very important findings that I think can go a long way in helping to shape policy in a much more positive and meaningful way for the longer term in this region. I appreciate your time coming here and taking questions from the audience. And I look forward to doing more webinars with you in the future and with your colleagues as well.
It was my pleasure. I'm always happy to get a chance to talk to you and to discuss the Caribbean. So anytime.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you to everyone who stayed with us on the call. And I hope you enjoyed the discussion and I hope you found it useful. And when you get a chance to talk to your policymakers and have an audience with them, perhaps you should send this report their way and share the findings with them so that we can help to have a better policy outcome in this region. Thank you, everybody. And thanks, Melissa, as well.